Welcome to this webinar series entitled Navigating New Waters, Calming the Rough Seas, and that would be the letter C's, Contracts, Crisis, and Conflict. Sponsored by the National Coalition for Public Procurement, this new organization leads the discussion on cooperative procurement best practices, collaboration efforts, and it strives to bring stakeholders together to solve real procurement issues. The companies and cooperative organizations listed here have contributed to make this free webinar series possible for public procurement professionals. I'm Tammy Rimes, former purchasing agent for the City of San Diego, and I now serve as a procurement consultant working with governments and companies across the country. So let's begin today's conversation with the lifespan of a contract. There are three major cycles, starting with the need, then the process, and then finally the management of that contract that is put into place. And that middle part, the process, that's where procurement spends a good portion of our time and energy. This is where we excel in our knowledge base. Frankly, it's our sweet spot. However, after the process is completed and the contract is signed, then that last part, management, the management of the contract is where we often hand the contract over to a customer department and they oversee it for the next 5 years. And if managed properly, our organization will receive the full benefit of all that time and effort that we put into that process portion. However, if it's not managed well or even neglected over the years, then the full leveraged value of that contract is lost. And let's admit it, with all that's going on in our offices on any given day or week, proper oversight can sometimes be overlooked or given very little attention as other priorities arise. And while there's a whole host of technical issues and reasons that I can give you to properly manage a contract, I'll just give you another real reason. Because something can go wrong, like really bad wrong. And a good purchasing professional needs to be just a bit paranoid. So ask yourself the 4 key questions. What could go wrong? What could be misunderstood? What is the public perception? And for those attorneys out there, what is our liability? If insurance renewals are not received, if supplier employees are not held accountable for their behaviors while conducting agency business, if deliveries aren't made in a timely or safe manner, or the contracts expire and nobody knows about it, we can be subject to lawsuits, exposure to public perception issues, or there can even be a public airing in the local news. And in the very worst cases, someone could actually get hurt or even die. One bad contract management situation can swallow up resources, time, and hurt reputations of the agency or the supplier, and no one needs that. So that leads us to this first topic of this webinar series, calming the rough seas, plotting the course to effective contract management. We will be talking with in-the-know procurement leaders across the nation on how they manage this important part of the contract life cycle. Beginning on the West Coast, we have invited Melissa Yusilon, the Director of Supply Chain Services for the City of Los Angeles, General Services Department. With over 15 years of experience in supply chain management, both in private and public, she is currently responsible for the overall performance, planning, direction, and staffing of all city commodity stores, purchasing, materials management, and all the related distribution activities on behalf of their council-controlled city department. And then outside her city role, she also serves as a U.S. Communities Advisory Board member. Welcome, Melissa. Now, the City of Los Angeles is the second largest city in the nation, with a population of 4 million people, covering an area of 465 square miles. In your city government, it has 42 departments and bureaus with 35,000 employees and a 15-member city council. Frankly, it's a size and demand that most of us can't even fathom serving, yet you and your team do it every day. So Melissa, can you share a bit? What are some of the greatest challenges in your procurement role?
As you mentioned, we're the second largest city, and my procurement staff is very small group. Today I only have 16 buyers and we procure over $480 million a year. And
Wow.
within the 16 buyers, we're managing all of the commodity supply and material needs for basically 22,000 square miles of city proper. That in itself is a challenge because we are constantly having to train our staff as we lose them through turnover. We have an aging workforce at the time, and then we have our proprietary agencies who like to use general services as a training ground. So it makes it a little difficult in keeping consistency just with our minimal staff size. We're streamlined to the point where anyone going on any type of leave or vacation at any given moment, it offsets the workload by having someone else bear that burden in the interim. So that in itself can be challenging. And one of the newest challenges that I've been faced with, and I've heard through the different conferences, is the purchasing of sustainable products and just sustainability not only on a product level but on a social economic level. Keeping local hires involved and making sure that any vendor who comes in is going to our community first to backfill any positions, and being able to offer those EPP products, because right now it's an encouragement, there's consideration, everything is still new, and there's this concern that EPP may not perform as good as our, original old, good old products that we've used in the past. So those are just a few of the challenges I personally face on a daily basis.
Yeah, I didn't realize you had such a lean team and for such a big organization. So with the spend volume of your city, this kind of leads into the next question. One would think when they hear City of Los Angeles and the spend volume that you have that you wouldn't even need to look at cooperative contracts. Yet you use them on a regular basis to fill some of your organization's needs. How do you decide when to use a cooperative contract rather than go out to bid, knowing that you have the spend capacity to get that good pricing?
That's a great question. That's something we deal with every day when we even pursue cooperative. So one of the big caveats is looking at the minimal resources, staffing resources we have here, looking at the political drive between various high-profile needs like office supplies, technology. That's always everyone has their eye on those items.
Right.
And being able to offset the amount of effort it goes into the processes you mentioned, developing the bid, making sure the market basket is encompassing of a good sampling of what we need, and going through the motions of preparing that, having it released on the street, and doing the analysis to determine it's the best award. And the City of Los Angeles, even though may have the leveraging of the buying power and the spend, doesn't need to recreate the wheel if another agency who has already done that. So that's one of the things we look for. We want to make sure that if one of our fellow brethren agencies have already invested their efforts in doing it and it has a similar scope and they've done the market basket that is in line with what the city needs are, that's something that we consider before we release our own competitive bid. We also look at time constraints. One of the best things that are available to us when we're dealing with grant money, whether it be federal or state, is ensuring that it's solicited, delivered, and paid for in time before we lose the grant money. So we look for cooperatives to allow us to ensure we are taking advantage of those grant funds. Another option is if our spend, even though we have such a large spend overall, if in one arena that, let's say, animal food, we're not having that significant buying power with that commodity, we would look to utilize a co-op who maybe leverage a multi-agency bid to ensure we're still getting the best price, even though our portion of that spend is minimal.
Right.
So those are a few of the areas we consider when we're looking at whether a co-op is in the best interest for the City of LA or issuing a standalone contract is in our best interest.
Right. And when you were talking about some of the challenges you have, I mean, the diversity of the City of Los Angeles, there's a delicate balance of consolidating spend into one or two big contracts where you can leverage and drive some savings But I know your city council and mayor is very big on participation of local businesses, local minority, women-owned businesses. And so with that rich diversity of businesses in the Los Angeles area, along with national suppliers who are also competing for City of LA opportunities, how do you manage or balance those efforts to be as inclusive as possible, but also to drive the savings and efficiencies?
That's always a difficult goal to reach. Even when we're looking, I'll go back to the previous question, even when we're looking at the cooperatives with different larger entities and different vendors, we look to them to see if they are open to establishing those partnerships and facilitating new relationships with any local entities we have here. We do our best in all of our competitive bids. They are advertised online. We also participate in various outreach events throughout the county to ensure that we're hitting every arena to ensure everybody is aware of the different opportunities to all of the enterprises that the city is holding, whether it's just on the commodity level or even on the service and construction side. We communicate with the other agencies to ensure if they're working on something that we could play a role in, or they have an outreach event that we can participate in and just send a representative, that we're making sure we're getting as much information on not just opportunities that are in the future, but something that we may have let in the past that can be a reoccurring need. So even though there is a contract for it, we want to make sure everyone's aware that there are still areas of opportunity, big and small, that could be coming up, and just don't think there is no opportunity today just because there's a contract, because there's always different projects and newer needs and different changes or technologies that are needed, that we need the support of the local enterprises. And we always try to introduce and partner up our local and small entities with some of our larger primary vendors to make sure that they're having that communication as well, and they can partner up not even on the city level, but potentially on other opportunities outside of the city.
Right. So in the beginning, I talked about the size of your city, 35,000 employees, and you have 42 departments and bureaus. So once procurement has put a contract in place, then obviously with such a lean staff, you cannot manage all those contracts. So you have to turn it over to another department to manage over the next few years. How has your team worked with those departments to make that transition more successful?
We go through an onboarding process with the different end-using departments to ensure that they understand that they play a key role in the success of the contract. We try to inform them not only of the delivery terms, which they're most wanting to know, but also the different consequences that can be enforced in the suppliers if they fail to meet any of the terms and conditions with the contracts. We have pre-award meetings with all of the end users, with our payment services department, with the vendor that's being awarded the contract, so they understand each of their responsibilities in making the contract a success. And even though we don't stay involved on the ordering side, we schedule quarterly meetings to bring everybody in to make sure whether there's good feedback or negative feedback, that everyone is aware they're being held accountable throughout the term of the contract. It's very important.
So those quarterly meetings, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but that's a really cool thing. So you have quarterly meetings that you invite all contract managers, or is it specific people that you invite? How do you handle those and coordinate those? Because, I mean, that's a cool idea. That's a great idea.
We hold them specific to the contract and the key end users or main end users of that contract. So every month we essentially are having these meetings with different contract vendors and the end users of those contracts. And like I said, we're empowering them not only to monitor and be responsible of the contract, but when we're requesting the feedback, negative or positive, they're also empowered to share the successes and see how things are working and how they can make improvements together versus as adversaries. Normally it's like, well, I've delivered and now you owe me this money, versus I've delivered and it's taken X number of days to process payment. Is there anything we can do to help streamline this a little bit, or what can we do better to make this more efficient?
So you turn it into a conversation instead of a adversarial.
Yes, correct. And we try to partner everyone together to make sure there's an ownership throughout each role of the contract process once it's been awarded and handed over, and that we act as big brother, if you will, to ensure if anything goes
Sure.
wrong, that we will be there to ensure resolutions and corrections are made in the timely manner, and proper action is taken if we need to get to that level.
Right, right. That's really proactive, really proactive. So through all your years in working in procurement and the supply chain management, you yourself have managed many city contracts over those years. And some of those have been multi-year and high-dollar contracts with high visibility. Now, 2020 is a great hindsight. Is there anything you wish you had known when you started managing contracts, sort of lessons learned over time that might be helpful to someone who's taking on a new leadership or contract manager role?
Well, I mean, I'm going to go back to more of a construction trade, or you check twice and cut once, right? And
Sure.
there's always, you mentioned in one of your first slides, always be prepared for what can go wrong. So
Yeah.
even though you think you're following the steps to getting to that award and you're doing everything in your power to make sure something, nothing can go wrong, there could be a protest, albeit unwarranted, but it's enough to have you present and go through the due diligence process that you've taken. So it's always good to ensure you follow all the steps, you don't take the shortcuts, you check twice, you cut once, and if anything is ever questioned, you're prepared to answer no matter how small or large the award is. There's never a cookie-cutter contract, even with cooperatives. You look for the best contract that meets your needs and the scope of work, but there's never always going to be that cookie-cutter perfect fit unless you're doing your standalone bid. And that in itself can always, or has the possibility of going wrong too. All it takes, working in the public sector, all it takes is for one protest, one grievance, whether it was warranted or not, and then you're in front of council or having to justify the steps that you took in order to serve your community. So I appreciate that you think I've learned a lot in my short time being in my role, but I still also network with the other agencies, and I take advantage of the different conferences to also learn how I can fine-tune our processes. And it's not always the larger cities who are at the forefront of innovation. Sometimes we look to agencies of various sizes and different agencies in education or K through 12 or local versus state to find out who's out there making changes that are going to make waves for the future.
Right, right. Well, thank you. I appreciate that insight, because a lot of times when I'm at conventions and people will say, well, I'm just from a small little organization, it's like, well, you know what? Everybody's doing innovative stuff out there. It doesn't matter size. It matters ideas, and that's what the important part is.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks, Melissa. I'm going to have you hang on because we're going to have some questions toward the end, but I'm going to head now over to the state of Arizona with Bill Munch. Bill currently serves as the Procurement, Compliance, and Training Officer for Valley Schools Management Group, a public entity insurance trust. He most recently was named 2016 Professional Manager of the Year by the National Institute of Governmental Purchasing. Congratulations, Bill, on winning the 2016 NIGP Manager of the Year award.
Thank you very much, Tammy. It's really an award that reflects the 3 chapters in Arizona. I've worked very closely with all 3 chapters in the last 4 years, and I really want to just thank the chapters for their support in my award. I'm very humbled by the award and very happy to be on this webinar today.
Well, thanks. So your achievements in Arizona are well known across that state. So how do you determine when is the best time to use a cooperative contract versus issuing your own procurement?
You know, a few years ago at the Capital Chapter of Arizona, we were asking ourselves that very question. We said to ourselves, you know what, in our heads, we kind of know how we do this. Let's put pen to paper. So what we did is we worked with several representatives of cities, counties, school districts, the state, every public entity we could reach out to within our organization, and we said, let's put together a model cooperative procurement program, a model process guideline that could be used as a standard across the state of Arizona as we start to think about these things. And that process guideline included the benefits of cooperative purchasing, strategic procurement planning, sources of information for public agencies, data analysis for public agencies, target contract format, types of contracts we could use, types of solicitations, composing the solicitation, the minimum legal policy requirements for lead public agencies, and contract administration that we're talking about today. Finally, we looked at audit requirements and results. But in direct answer to the question, one of the things we created was a checklist. Okay, we're looking at a procurement. Every single procurement stands on its own. Should we go out for this procurement, or should we look at the possibility of buying off of a cooperative? Well, the first thing we knew we needed to look at was, is there a cooperative purchase agreement in place that allows us to use the contract? Second, and most importantly, was the procurement done by a public procurement unit? Because in Arizona, as it is across many of the states across the nation, you have to have a public procurement unit leading that procurement in order to use a public procurement contract. Then we looked at, do the terms and conditions of the scope and work specifications meet the needs of our agency? If we can get past that question, then we look at, if there's no terms and conditions in scope, are they negotiable? Can we negotiate some of those? It should be noted here that if terms and prices were negotiated, can we further negotiate those? You want to look at those types of things when you're looking at these contracts. Also, does the cooperative contract provide for the most advantageous solution for our agency, and why? Is the contract in effect and in full force for all of the proposed purchases? Will any and all purchases comply with the terms and prices in the contract? What were there volume advantages to using that cooperative contract? Are there any fees associated? And if there's any fees associated with the contract, are they reasonable and justified? And we've already discussed this a little bit, where local and regional vendors offered the opportunity to compete with the contracts. Yeah, we want to use national contracts, but we want to know that we can keep some of the local spend within our own jurisdiction. Did the cooperative or lead agency have the expertise, reputation, and history of quality contracting for the good or service? Another question is, was there past experience with the cooperative or lead agency? And if so, was that experience acceptable? And the last few questions we came up with is it a unique purchase that's better serviced by another contract? Is it an urgently needed item? Sometimes a cooperative contract can really save your butt, and what I mean by that is, hey, you come up with a purchase you need, it's over your procurement threshold, it would take weeks to put it out, but wow, that contract is available through a cooperative. We can do that in a much more timely fashion. The last thing we looked at was the age of the contract. How many years is it into the contract term? Has it been 4 or 5 years since the contract was bid? And if so, is there changes that have happened in the marketplace that maybe that contract isn't as good as it has been in the past? So those are the kind of things we looked at. Again, we put this together in a master process guideline. I definitely have it available if anyone would like to see it. It lasts for about 7 pages. The goal of the document was to create, like I say, standard format of, hey, these are things you might want to look at when you're doing cooperative purchasing and contract administration within your organization. Thank you very much, Tammy.
Oh, no, that's great. And actually, one of the reasons that you were invited on this panel today was because of that document that you put together, Bill, which is a great document for others to look at and use as well. But the other reason I invited you on here is because you've shared your opinion about contract management, and you've said, and I'll quote, "It's often the most overlooked part of the procurement process." And I agree with that. So can you explain that statement and why you advocate for stronger contract management skill sets?
Sure. I'll start with saying that, you know, I've got a 4-year degree in purchasing from Arizona State University. Go Sun Devils. Have to put that out there.
Wait a minute.
And we talked a lot about procurement, but we didn't spend a whole lot of time in contract administration. And then when I went to work for the Arizona State Procurement Office in 1989, spent a lot of time doing state contracts, but we really weren't given enough time to do the contract administration piece. I just think we spend a lot of time dealing with what we're really good at, which is putting out our bids, cutting our purchase orders, reviewing our requisitions, doing those types of things. But really, it's critical to look at contract administration. And I'm not just talking about expediting when somebody calls you and says, hey, this didn't get here. What can you do to get it here faster? Or just follow up, hey, is our item going to be delivered on time? What we're actually talking about is contract administration is the activities the buyer performs after a contract has been awarded to determine how well the buyer and the contractor performed to meet those contract requirements. All dealings between the buyer and the contractor from the time the contract is awarded until the work is complete, accepted, and paid. It includes resolution of disputes, contracts, controversies, and claims, and or termination of the contract. We need to have a focus on attaining supplies and services in the specified quantity of the specified quality on time and within budget. The exercise of skill and judgment in determining the proper course of action in administering the contract in order to protect the public interest. We want to have fair and equitable treatment of all parties involved in the contract. We want to make sure our documentation is sufficient to substantiate any and all contract decisions. The contract is not complete when the order is placed. All contracts require some level of contract administration. And as I said before, contract administration is probably the most overlooked part of public procurement. Contract administration is probably the task school personnel and public officials are least prepared to perform, but it's the primary tool for contract administration, and that primary tool is the contract. There are a number of things to consider before the contract is written and signed. When we're putting our procurements together, we should be putting them together with consideration of how is this contract going to be administered. And I just think at times we fall down in that regard because we're so busy doing all the other things trying to put our purchases together.
Right, right. And in the end, the contract management, while purchasing represents the organization, as you mentioned there, we have to be fair to the vendor community as well and make sure they're being treated fairly and that they can comply with the scope of work and the specifications. So that leads me to that vendor and supplier. When monitoring or rating the performance of any supplier under a contract, what steps do you take to ensure a good working relationship throughout the course of the contract?
Tammy, the first thing we need to do is provide the tools. We need to define the performance requirements within the contract itself, which means within the solicitation up front. We have to identify those measurement tools in the contract. And when we're doing that, we want to make sure we're using sound judgment. And here's one of the most critical pieces. We want to designate a responsible party that is going to be responsible for the contract administration piece. We want to use those tools. We want to follow through on the requirements, make sure we formally report the outcomes. We want to limit contract administration to managing by exception, only dealing with those issues that come up. A common form of contract administration is to do it by exception, but that's not the best way. The best practice is basically defined as action taken prior to there being complaints. We don't wait for the complaints to come in. We try and avoid those complaints. Because if we manage by exception, that's generally not an effective way to handle contract administration. We want to be timely. We want to follow up on the contractor schedule and promptly report and address any findings or any issues within the contract. We want to be decisive. We want to avoid that one more chance trap. Oh, we'll just give that vendor one more chance, he'll perform. No, we want to follow up on those issues. We want to make firm action decisions. We want to clearly define the decisions and requirements. Here's a big thing. Do what you say you're going to do. If you're going to tell the vendor they have to do this certain thing under the contract, hold them to that. It's our responsibility as good procurement professionals to make sure that happens. Be reasonable. Responsibility is to do the right thing. Sometimes doing the right thing means finding in the vendor's favor. We need to realize that. Every decision must be honest, ethical, and comply with the contract. Common vendor performance activities are going to include receiving an inspection to verify specification compliance and condition of goods, quality assurance testing and review to ensure products perform as desired or promised, milestone monitoring to ensure schedules are met. Some of our procurements last over several months. There should be milestones built into those months, as was discussed earlier. Performance assessment. How is the vendor actually doing? We want to do routine reporting through receiving reports, work orders, payment applications. We want to have defined reporting through formal vendor reports, formal vendor non-performance reports, former product, service, and vendor requests, satisfaction surveys, formal contract volume reports, following up on the contract. What's happened in this contract? Did we really have a good contract? Nothing's more embarrassing to me than to extend a contract that we have and everybody goes, ugh, why are we extending with that vendor? If we had good feedback, that would never happen.
Sure.
Proper contract administration will keep that situation from happening. Thank you, Tammy.
No, that's great. Great points, Bill. In fact, a whole host of points. I appreciate that. That was great. And I love that you said within there that we don't just manage by exception, because when I do there's a contract management training that I do, and I give different scenarios and let the audience work through those scenarios. And the final scenario is one where the contractor on the surface is doing everything perfect. They won an award by the city council, the contract is going smooth, and then I look at the audience and say, so what do you do in this situation? And a lot of times they just stare back at me, and I say, this is in fact a good contractor, but we still have to monitor the good contractors as well as those who are not doing so well. So constant. You have to stay constantly on them, as you said, because over the course of several years, you have to make sure that good behavior continues. So thanks for making all those points.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tammy.
So now we're moving over to Texas, and our third panelist is well known across the nation for her public procurement knowledge. Beth Fleming has held the position of the Director of Purchasing for Denton County since 1992, was elected to the Member Council of NIGP in 2015, and she also serves as an NIGP certified instructor. Beth has also served as the former chair and an evaluator for the Achievement of Excellence in Procurement Award established by MPI. And under her leadership, Denton County is one of only 6 government entities across the United States to receive that Achievement of Excellence in Procurement Award for all 21 years since its inception. So welcome, Beth.
Hello. How are you today?
Well, good, and I'm so glad you're on here because I have sat in many of your training sessions, and I always take away something that I knew that I learned. So thank you for being with us today.
Well, thank you, Tammy, and I also appreciate just the opportunity to present today and also listen to the other two that have already presented because I've already made lots of notes.
Okay. Well, as I stated, you're an excellent trainer and speaker, and you have sat in as an evaluator for the National Procurement Institute's Achievement and Excellence Award. So one of the criteria in that award relates to procurement teams providing training, either to their customer departments or to suppliers during those how to do business trainings. So as someone who does it well, what would you suggest to someone who wants to make their own internal contract management training program even better?
Well, I'm not sure we do it well all of the time. If you'd been a little bird in our office this week, you would have seen some missteps. But we do try to establish processes to support our clients who are responsible for managing the contracts. I believe the key is to focus on what your audience, whether it's internal customers or the suppliers, what they need to know to facilitate a successful procurement, which includes, of course, the period after the purchase order is issued or the contract is signed. Depending on what your structure is, this is unfortunately the point in time when the procurement staff files that project away, or as we like to say, they shove it over the cliff to the end user, and they quickly move on to the next solicitation. The critical element is to understand that full cycle of cradle to grave and understand how well-developed specifications contribute to a successful contract management process through the final payment. And Bill kind of touched on that as well and explained that process and how important it is. When focusing on complex, large expenditure projects and high-risk service contracts, it's important that procurement take the lead and facilitate the roles and responsibilities of the contract management team. Anticipating risk and the likelihood and consequence of each different risk begins early in the project and specification development. And of course, all risks can't be anticipated or controlled, but your specification should be vetted for potential non-performance issues, including default. And like Tammy said, you have to be a little bit paranoid to be a buyer.
Thank you for agreeing with that statement. I thought it was just me, but I thought we all need to be.
I thought that's exactly right. Denton County just recently had a landscaping contract with a new firm, and we had several issues at the onset, and after several preliminary steps were taken, we issued a non-compliance letter and the contractor submitted a corrective action plan. It was discovered that the root cause of was that the on-site supervisor responsible for knowing the scope of work was basically non-existent. And then all of a sudden we had a significant incident where all the prior season's perennial plants in 3 large beds in front of our most prominent building were mysteriously and erroneously removed by the crew, about 800 plants. And we sent a second non-compliance letter and told them to either replace the plants or we'd have them replaced, and they would be responsible for the expense. They failed to do either, and of course we terminated the contractor for default. I talked about identifying risk in the spec development phase, but we certainly didn't include a clause in our specifications anticipating this specific risk in our specs.
Sure.
But we were able to declare default because we did have language about non-compliance issues and damage to property and the liability of that. So more on point of the training, we attempt to prepare the individuals on the team for their role. We have on-site meetings and regular training with our end users. But too many times contracts are dropped into their laps with no instructions or expectations for accountability. You know, we need to train those field managers or project managers, whatever nomenclature you use, and we need to make sure that we identify the expectations of your agency for conducting inspections, verifying compliance, of course authorizing payment, and reporting on performance. They need to know what their authority level is and what their role is specifically on that contract. With service contracts with new companies, we also assist to set up kickoff meetings that includes the contractor and the field manager and most of the time administration. So this is similar to a pre-construction meeting for a construction project. And then to further assist the field managers, we also set up online performance survey forms that are issued on a quarterly basis and a discrepancy reporting structure that is monitored by the assigned sourcing team member.
Right.
It's important that they understand the hierarchy for contract management and when they need to elevate the issue to procurement for more formal communication.
Well, and you mentioned your vendors and suppliers, and I guess if they pulled all the plants out in front of a prominent building, people are going to kind of notice that the next morning, aren't they? Yeah. I could see that your phone started ringing right away.
Exactly, exactly. Those that knew that there were perennials and supposed to be there.
Somebody picked all the flowers.
Yeah.
So ineffective contract management, it involves developing that good working relationship with the vendors and suppliers. So how do you handle a situation when the vendor's not complying with the scope of work, or there's a county employee that seems to misunderstand how they should be communicating to the vendor?
That doesn't happen in our agency, Tammy.
Wow.
Well, it's important to take stock of any non-compliance issue and proceed through the steps that are intended to seek compliance by both parties. We want them to succeed. It's in all of our benefit. If they look good, we look good. So it's similar to an HR progressive disciplinary plan with the goal of changing behavior for everyone's benefit. So first, always verify the facts by identifying the problem or issue, trying to ascertain the root cause. Hopefully your field manager has kept you in the loop and has provided good communication on his efforts to date. But you'll still want to review that against the requirements of the contract and scope of work, review the field manager's documentation, and make sure that they are not exploiting the contract or misunderstanding the scope of work or contract terms. For an example, we had an issue this week with a new janitorial contract for about 30 buildings that started 3 weeks ago. And the field manager in our facilities department took complaints from many employees on poor service all over the county, and then they escalated the problem to us, indicating that they did not believe the contractor was going to work out. This is the first 3 weeks of the contract. So
wow, you're not even into it yet.
I know. We expect a little bit of transition.
Exactly.
So we quickly set up a meeting and found out it was a really poor communication from the county, and they also had inadequate access to all the areas due to their access cards being misprogrammed once again by the County Facilities Department. So we were the person in between, the liaison in between the two, and quickly resolved those issues, reiterated with our county staff on how important it was for them to communicate and verify that the information they've given them is wrong. So, when looking at any kind of problem like that, if the issue is valid, you need to proceed with your first step of communication, which is, of course, dictated by the severity of the discrepancy. And you may need to communicate in writing with a non-compliance letter asking for a specific corrective action plan within a specified time period. Always tie it to a time period. Or it may involve scheduling a meeting with all parties, as we did this week in our office. So our sourcing team will typically consult on non-compliance issues as a group, either in our weekly meetings or as needed. So as each buyer is working on different contracts with their end users, we group back together and try to learn from each other and consult and make sure that we understand all of the issue completely and all the relevant factors and possible consequences of any action by procurement. It sometimes sounds like we just drop that heavy hammer and go ahead and send that notice of default, and maybe we need to take some time and really think about all those consequences. So the goal basically is to attempt to mediate the problem and only place the supplier in breach if there's no other resolution found, within a reasonable amount of time. And of course, always we consult with our attorneys and governing body if there's any potential breach of contract significant enough to declare default and subsequent termination.
Right. And I like that you mentioned and caveated that there needs to be a time period in which they make the correction, and literally that's a case by case depending on what the contract is, what the roles are.
Exactly.
So for instance, I was working with a particular agency, and they had a problem with the janitorial staff coming in every evening and forgetting to lock the back door and setting the alarm. And their question to me was, well, how much time should we give them to correct this? And I was like, no time, immediately. They're not locking the back door. You need to fix it tonight. So a timetable can be right away, or a timetable could be, 5 working days or 10 calendar days, depending on what the project's about.
Right. And what we try to do is our first communication with them, we ask for a corrective action plan. So your plan from them is their statement saying we will correct this and this is how we'll do it. And we want that quick. We realize that the actual fix may take longer, but we want that plan immediately. And it's their acknowledgement that they will work on correcting it.
Right. So you talk about when you are managing your own contract, something that you put out to RFP or bid and award it, but when you're piggybacking on another contract, whether it's a state contract or a national cooperative, how do you approach the management of that type of contract, one that you did not bid or put in place, but now you're going to be using for goods or services for the next 2 years?
That's a good question, Tammy, and I think I've got some good responses based on lessons learned. So, cooperatives are an excellent tool for public procurement to leverage our spend. However, it can be used as a free pass to avoid performing basic buyer due diligence. So like Melissa said, there's not a cookie cutter co-op contract that will meet all of your specific needs. So if it works for you, you can use it, but you have to make sure that you understand all those terms and conditions. So the first step really begins prior to making the purchase. It's important to analyze the base contract and the specifications issued by the awarding agency or co-op that you're using, and determine if it meets your needs, first of all, of course, and adequately protects your entity. This analysis is really the same risk assessment exercise or due diligence required if you're going to bid the service or product yourself. But too many times I hear about agencies, and we've been guilty of this too, who only ask to see the contract and specifications when there's a non-compliance issue, after the fact.
Right.
So if you're looking at long-term service or technology implementation contracts or any kind of complex and high-value purchases, you need a complete review of the documents before you actually make the purchase, if it's a co-op contract. Ask to see the specifications, ask to see the proposal, ask to see the final contract. Look at all of that. Most contracts will allow for local negotiation of specific terms, and of course we know you usually can negotiate if you have a high volume, but look at all the terms and conditions as well. Those need to be clearly documented and formalized in your own agency's PO or contract. Once the purchase is made and the contract management begins, the process for, of course, mitigating non-compliance issues should be very similar to the progressive steps you would take for one of your own contracts. But of course you need to stay within the parameters of the base contract issued by the co-op and make sure that those are in compliance as well. So as hard enough as it is to control and mitigate non-compliance issues, it will definitely be significantly more difficult if you don't accept and understand the original terms before you make that purchase.
Well, good contract management, we've heard from all three of our panelists, is crucial to our organizations. And when done properly, the results can be outstanding with savings and uninterrupted services for our customer departments. Now, most of you listening in, you have several contracts that you manage, and in looking at that long list of contracts that you oversee, you may not be able to manage them all with the same level of effort. There's only so many hours during the work week. So here's a suggestion. Take the contracts that you're responsible for and then rank them according to risk tolerance. So if it's a higher dollar contract, if it's a broader or more complex project, if there's a lot of direct interaction with the public, those may rise to the top to have more oversight. Because in truth, we aren't really managing a contract, we're really managing the people and the activities related to that contract. So I'm glad our panelists are still on the line because we did have some questions come in. So in round robin style, Melissa, Bill, and Beth, I have some questions for you. So starting with Melissa, you mentioned that you go to conferences yourself. Even though you are from a large city, there's always something new to learn. So the exhibit hall, that tends to be the one part that seems to be a little overwhelming to folks. When you walk in, particularly some of the larger conferences, there can be hundreds of booths. What is your strategy when you go in there to talk to either cooperatives you've never heard of or the vendor community to try to broaden your own research and outreach?
That's a great question. So before any conference, at the start of the conference, you're typically handed a guide or you download an application that tells you the layout of the mapping and the vendors that are going to be available. Based and dependent on the different opportunities that we have forthcoming within the city or different needs that we're aware of future projects, I try to identify the vendors that have that same offering. And those are the first entities I go to. I try to schedule meet and greets with and get more information and determine who their local contact is for the city of Los Angeles so I can do a follow-up. Those are always the booths that I hit first.
Okay, so you have a plan before you even go to the conference. You already know kind of who you're looking for when you hit that hall.
That is correct. Based on, like I said, just opportunities and needs that we know are arising or that we've heard of different trends and vendors who have innovative ideas, those are the vendors that I try to monitor and identify where they're located on the map first and foremost. So when I hit the exhibit hall, that's where I beeline for, and then after there I'll then branch out and see if there's any other vendors I may have missed on the list, but I always try to make contact with those initial vendors first.
Okay, cool. And then Bill, on to you. You had a very comprehensive checklist on managing contracts. Here's something that used to come up for me. We would hand the contract over a customer department. We would thoroughly train that person and they would be doing a great job. And then 3 years into the contract, that person either gets promoted to another department or they retire and leave the organization altogether. And the contract they were managing either sits in a drawer somewhere or it either didn't get handed over or it did get handed over, but the new person handling it doesn't know all the requirements. How do you address that issue when contracts are floating out there for a number of years and the people keep changing?
I know at Mesa Public Schools, every year before we renewed a contract, we confirmed that the contract administrator was still there and still available, And if they weren't, we would say to that end-using school or department, all right, who's going to be the new one, because we need to have a meeting with them so that this contract doesn't fall down. So it's a constant communication on a regular basis with your end users to say, who's managing this contract? And if the contract manager changes, they were also required to notify us when that was taking place.
So you actually go out and survey once a year to make sure, so you have a list of the names and the contact information for each person who's managing a contract for the organization.
It was part of the renewal process when we renewed our contracts, yes.
Okay. And
so
then
that happened throughout the year as contracts expired.
So when contracts are expiring, who gets notified? Is it procurement? Is it the customer department? How does that process happen with the renewals or the expiration coming up?
90 days before a renewal or an expiration of a contract, we're in touch with the department. Usually if it's an expiration, we would put that out to 120 days. In other words, if we're in the 5th year of a 5-year contract, we add an extra month to that process. But if it's just a renewal, we do about 90 days out. We talk to the end-using department. Is this need still necessary? Who's going to continue to manage this contract? Are there any changes we need to make? Because here's the thing. Many times we do many of our contracts for 5 years, 1 + 4 annual renewals. But it's sometimes we're 2 or 3 years into the contract, and it needs to be changed because things change. We shouldn't just assume because we've done a 5-year contract that it's automatically going to go the 5 years. So again, when I was at Mesa Public Schools, we would review that on a regular basis every time the renewal process came up.
Right, right. So Beth, I want to switch over to you on, it sounds like in Bill's case, purchasing takes the lead on renewing contracts, knowing when they're coming up. How about for you, Denton County? Is purchasing in control of that, or is the user departments in control?
We're very similar to Bill, that we are in control of that, and we have a online system that electronically notifies us the same time periods that Bill talked about, depending on whether or not it was a renewal or an expiration. And the buyer that is responsible for that contract begins the process of verifying all of the performance data and then getting with the end user to see if they are ready to renew or if they want to renew, what any issues that we have. We look at quantities that we bought, the type of products we bought, if it's in kind of term contract with supplies, to make sure we're buying in compliance with the terms, or if it needs to be reissued as a bid because we have changed our habits or our buying habits. So all of that is initiated, by us, and we work with the field managers to make those decisions early.
Okay, I'm going to ask kind of a loaded question, and any one of you can answer this if you're so inclined. Have you ever had an issue where one of your customer departments just doesn't get it? They just don't get what their role is, or they just say, you know what, this is purchasing's job. This shouldn't be my job, and they really put little to no effort into the contract management. How do you handle that situation? Because it's tough. It's a peer. It's not somebody you supervise, and yet you really need them to do that job for the organization. Is there an approach you take with that has worked with you for you in the past? Any one of you can answer that if you've had an example.
Tammy,
Beth,
this is Beth. Okay.
I'm going to pick on Beth because I know you probably had one.
Yeah, we have, and it depends, of course, on the situation, the personality, and also, their level in management. But ultimately, the success of that contract is our responsibility more than the end user, even though it's for their benefit. So we have had some who have done very poor jobs in management, and although we can train them, we can talk to them and tell them what they need to do,
sure,
we pick up the slack a lot of times in those contracts because we still need them to be successful.
Right.
So we have gone above some field managers' heads to their supervisors and talk to them, but those are not my choice on who they put on those contracts.
True.
I heard at the last conference we were at that when the speakers said, they banned that person from working on the contract. And I think if there was something, fraud or something
sure,
like that,
of course,
to do, but just to say they're incompetent, that's a more difficult thing to do, and normally I don't have the ability to make those decisions in my entity, but we will pick up that slack if we have to, so it's in our interest to help them do a good job.
Sure. The job still needs to get done, and in the end, if something happens wrong on the contract, the first finger gets pointed at purchasing,
Exactly.
and it's very difficult for us to just turn around and try to point to someone else, because usually we are the ones that have to fix it.
Right, right.
So thank you guys for answering those questions. So in addition to this webinar series, the National Coalition for Public Procurement also strives to create unique educational materials and work tools that are meaningful to our public procurement teams. In fact, Bill mentioned early on his checklist that he used for Arizona. Well, based on the last set of webinars that we conducted over the summer on cooperative procurement, something real came out of that. Many of the people on those calls were asking for a checklist. So Marquita Gillespie was speaking, and she talked about her checklist. People wanted a copy of that. Sergio Paneque from the City of New York and the State of New York had a checklist, and people wanted that. So we took that as that people really do want some resources, and we decided to collect all of those different checklists across the country, whether it be from a city, a county, all types of entities, and we pulled that information into this brand new roadmap to a cooperative purchasing strategy. It was unveiled last week at the National Procurement Institute conference, and no matter what type of agency you work for or where you're located across the country, we tried to create a resource that can be your go-to document to assess and evaluate the use of cooperative contracts. So it's sort of a non-denominational, inclusive approach. If you're looking at a regional contract, if you're looking at a national contract, or if you're even looking at one that was created by a group of government entities, this is a good checklist before you get started. How to evaluate the National Cooperative Organization. Once you've chosen the contract, how do you evaluate the contract? And then there's a vendor associated with those contracts. What kind of questions should you be asking? So you are feel free to pull up on the NCPP website. You can download the roadmap. It is a roadmap. It's a large foldout. So if you would also like a hard copy, we will give you a complimentary poster-sized copy just by emailing us at NCPP. We'd be happy to mail it to you. Part of the strategy of these webinars is to gather your questions, the information you are wanting, and to come up with materials that can be used for free by the public procurement community. So after this webinar, you are going to be receiving a survey, and I know many of us don't have time to complete surveys, but here's my ask of you. When you get to the part of the survey that asks you, what other topics would you like to be held? What kind of information are you looking for? Please let us know, because part of the effort is we are reaching out across the country for in-the-know procurement professionals to pull together that information for you. We appreciate you joining us today. We also appreciate our panelists being part of this. Please sign up and attend our next two webinar series. The next one, Emergency Preparedness, was a huge hit during our summer series. We will have not only procurement folks, but we will have key leaders from customer departments like Fleet and Public Works who also have to deal with emergencies. And then in February, Walking the Plank, negotiations, protest, and conflict management. It's one of those toughest part of our jobs, and we actually don't get much training in this, and it's something that we need to learn. Each one of these webinars counts toward 1 hour of continuing education credit. In addition to your certificate, which will be emailed to you within the week, you'll be receiving that survey that I mentioned. We really do value your feedback and ideas for future training sessions. This is Tammy Rhymes, and I wish you the best as you go forth and procure. Thank you.